Long before Europeans explored Puerto Rico, the lush Caribbean island was home to thriving Indian tribes that developed rich histories and lively cultures. The most recent of these Indian peoples were the Taino. Living along the shores of Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands, the Taino supported themselves by fishing and farming. They had a complex social structure, an economy in which women played a vital role, and an impressive tradition of stone sculpture. Sailing for the Spanish crown, Christopher Columbus landed on Puerto Rico in 1493. A Spanish soldier named Juan Ponce de Leon set up the first Spanish settlement there in 1508 and became the island's first governor. His arrival initiated 400 years of Spanish domination, in which the native inhabitants were enslaved and the island's resources exploited.
Los conquistadores were the Spaniards. We refer to them as the Spaniards, who arrived in Puerto Rico in 1493. Who they encountered in Puerto Rico at that time were the Taino Indians, who were an advanced society of indigenous people, mostly people who lived off the land. The relationship was one first of experimentation and discovery, and then it led to immediately a relationship of exploitation and war.
The decrease of the Taino population by the middle of the 16th century and the spread of large sugarcane plantations prompted Spain to import new slaves for the mines and farms of Puerto Rico. Indeed, African slave labor became the vital ingredient in the Spanish colony's sugarcane economy. From the middle to the end of the 16th century, Puerto Rico became a successful producer of sugarcane. But the arrival of African slaves had another effect on Puerto Rican history. It contributed to a truly mixed culture. Black people from Africa became the third major ethnic component in the Puerto Rican nationality, the others being Indians and native-born islanders of Spanish descent. Over the years, these three groups intermarried, creating a society of various skin colors and ethnic mixtures, a true rainbow people. Over the next few centuries, Britain and other European powers tried to take Puerto Rico from Spain. Puerto Ricans of all three ethnic groups staged many defenses of the island in acts that cemented their emerging national identity. But independence was not to be. When the U.S. and Spain went to war in 1898, the Americans invaded the island, and the defeated Spanish turned over Puerto Rico and other territories to the United States.
The U.S. acquired Puerto Rico as a result of the Spanish-American War, and in 1898 the U.S. Army entered Puerto Rico through Guanica, and that was as a result of an agreement, or the peace treaty, between Spain and the United States. Ever since then, Puerto Rico has been an official part of this country.
Puerto Ricans are born as U.S. citizens. It is a commonwealth of the United States and has been for the last 95 years. And as a result, Puerto Ricans can travel to the United States, the mainland of the United States, without any immigration check.
The American Army administered the island for 2 years. Then, in 1900, the U.S. passed the 4-Acre Act, granting civil government to Puerto Rico. But the act dictated that most important government officials in Puerto Rico, including the governor and Supreme Court, would be appointed by the U.S. president. In 1917, the U.S. and Puerto Rico hammered out a series of reforms. Under President Woodrow Wilson, the Jones Act granted U.S. citizenship to any Puerto Rican who didn't refuse it. Just about everyone accepted, since rejection meant fewer civil rights and no chance to hold public office. Soon after, registration for the U.S. military draft went into effect, and large numbers of Puerto Ricans fought in World War I.
Many Puerto Ricans, since 1917, since they had been official citizens and were obligated for military draft, had come to serve in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and had stayed in this country as a result of their service, their military service.
Not until 1947 did Puerto Ricans win the right to elect their own governors. Luis Muñoz Marin became the first island-born chief executive. In the 1950s, Puerto Rico became an American Commonwealth and picked up more self-rule. But over the next 40 years, some Puerto Ricans argued that their island should become America's 51st state, while others demonstrated for the opposite, complete independence. Until recently, most Puerto Ricans have preferred to keep things as they are. Being part of the U.S. protects their economy and provides defense without threatening their culture or language.
The same pride that I think all citizens of the United States have about being part of this country is the same pride that Puerto Ricans have, but they still have a country and a heritage and a nation that they're extremely proud of and committed to. It's almost like a dual relationship.
Puerto Ricans started coming to the mainland at least a century and a half ago, when a small number of craftsmen and merchants settled in New York. But the big migration began after Spain ceded the country to America. By 1910, Puerto Ricans could be found in most of America's states. Puerto Ricans moved to the mainland in even larger numbers as the 20th century wore on. The reasons were mostly practical. The island's population had doubled in the first quarter of the 20th century, and then a series of economic blows hit hard. Hurricanes struck in 1928 and 1932. Prices for sugar, Puerto Rico's biggest export, fell during the Depression. Then, in 1935, the United States raised its minimum wage to 25 cents, crippling the low-wage needlework industry and throwing thousands of Puerto Rican women out of work. By 1940, soaring population and withering farm employment nearly destroyed the island's economy. When World War II ended 5 years later, thousands of unemployed and underpaid Puerto Ricans headed to the mainland, especially to New York City. But this wasn't a migration across national borders. Puerto Ricans were already U.S. citizens and could enter as though crossing from one state to the next.
There has traditionally been a lot of racism and discrimination directed at Puerto Ricans, that somehow they're not full Americans and aren't deserving of all the rights and benefits. And that's an unfortunate tradition that hopefully we're going to get rid of in our lifetime.
It was very rough. They came from a different economic level. They were very poor. They were varied in skin color. They were an agricultural people. They spoke a different language. They came from a tropical atmosphere and a culture that was adapted to living in a tropical country. So what they found was a very hostile and difficult space. But like all immigrant groups to New York specifically, they found their niche and made their space and developed communities and organizations to support their immigration.
Of course, New York wasn't their only destination. Many moved to Chicago and Philadelphia, and large communities sprouted in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Miami. Puerto Ricans who moved to California were especially successful. In San Francisco and Los Angeles, they tended to be better educated, fewer were poor, and many had professional or managerial jobs. Not all Puerto Ricans moved straight to the cities. In the early 30s, U.S. employers needed farm workers from Puerto Rico, and by 1940, many Puerto Ricans were migrant field hands along the Atlantic coast. In Puerto Rico, where many people harvested sugarcane, seasonal work ran from January to June or July. On the mainland, harvesting fell during the inactive period in Puerto Rico, so year-round work was available for workers willing to travel between the island and the mainland. In 1947, new federal laws protected Puerto Rican migrant laborers. Mainland farmers who hired native Puerto Ricans were required to sign contracts approved by Puerto Rico's Labor Department. The contracts didn't solve every problem for migrant workers, but they made things better. Since then, 20,000 contract farm workers have come to the mainland each year. American lifestyles in the cities and towns near their farms have enticed some of these workers to explore permanent employment on the mainland. But many Puerto Ricans who moved to these small cities and towns became the targets of discrimination. Puerto Ricans had come to the mainland seeking a better social and economic situation. They supplied a cheap force of unskilled and semi-skilled labor in industries like garment making and service businesses. But the flight of these industries in recent decades to the southern U.S. and abroad has lowered Puerto Rican employment. Today, with most Puerto Ricans still below the poverty level, and Puerto Ricans worse off socially, economically, and politically than other Latino groups in America, Puerto Ricans face a long struggle. Mainland Puerto Ricans face other challenges as well. One of the most important is the language barrier.
The stereotype, because if you speak another language, people in this country seem to think that if you have an accent, you're dumber or you're stupid, and don't understand that an accent has nothing to do with your capacity to think or to obtain information. Actually, one of our assets is that we're bilingual, that we have two languages.
Schools were slow in helping Spanish-speaking students, and that meant little chance for high-paying jobs. A shortage of bilingual teachers and money for special programs only made the problem worse. But in the past 15 years, urban schools, especially in New York, have hired Spanish-speaking teachers and have begun schooling in both English and Spanish for immigrant students. While tackling these challenges in the coming years, Puerto Ricans will also have to decide what kind of relationship with the United States will guarantee the best future for their culture and for their children, both on the mainland and on their Caribbean island.
One of the questions that we have to struggle with as Americans is, what is the United States government's role with Puerto Rico? What's going to happen in the future? And I think it's unfair to the Puerto Rican people to kind of be neither here nor there. I would guess that within the next few decades, a decision is going to have to be made one way or the other.
A lot of the challenges have to do with language barriers, poverty, the need for better housing, for better educational opportunities, less racism and prejudices, less stereotyping, more understanding. I think that it's a large challenge. Puerto Ricans are ready to face it, but there's a lot to do ahead of us.
When I first came to New York, I thought it was going to be like paradise. Everything perfect, very pretty. And I thought the people were going to be very friendly, and everything was going to be there. But I found that was not true. And the people, they were not as friendly as I thought they were going to be. Like, they don't stop and say hi or have a conversation. It's just, hello, good morning, and just go. I came to the United States because of the economics. In Puerto Rico, it's very hard to get a job.